Deaths in Custody is a painting by Trevor Nichols. This painting has a sombre feel which refers to the appalling results into the Royal Commission investigation into the Aboriginal deaths in custody in 1987. This painting echoes the struggles of Indigenous Australians. Nichols seldom undertook overtly political themes. However, the extreme number of Indigenous prisoners found deceased in their prison cells was of huge concern to Nichols. Over the last few decades, the history of the colonisation of Australia between European settlers and the Indigenous peoples of Australia has been greatly debated. For several years, historians presented Australian history as beginning when Captain Cook landed in Botany Bay in 1770. This version of history is usually what is taught in the education system and can be seen in many history books throughout the decades. This version of history teaches how Australia in the late 18th century was basically a vacant country that was suitable for colonisation, how Australia was discovered, and about how the white settlers courageously fought the elements and the Indigenous peoples to create a civilised society in Australia. History books and the schooling system over the years have described Australian history as one of settlement, discovery, development, expansion, and the growth of federation. However, the Indigenous view of Australian history is quite different to this. Australian history to Indigenous Australians is one of violent invasion, the obliteration of culture, stolen land, profound loss, epidemics, disease, and death. It is a history of displacement, the separation of children and families. To Indigenous Australians, Australian history is a history of racism, abusiveness, and the extreme use of social control through the domination of cruel government policies, where they were treated like criminals and forced to obey white man's law. The mistreatment and impact of European colonisation for the first people did not only impact the first Australians, but has continued to impact the Australian Aborigines of today. Due to a horrific past, many Aboriginal Australians today suffer from intergenerational trauma. Without the understanding of intergenerational trauma and its effect on individuals, Aboriginal communities and families, often leads to several people wondering why Indigenous Australians can't just move on or get over it. When individuals have an understanding of intergenerational trauma, it can help individuals to see how the events of Australian history have impacted today's Indigenous Australians, which can then assist to shed light and to give a better understanding of the complexity of the situation that many Indigenous communities and people face today. Trauma is usually understood as an individual's response to a catastrophic incident. The incident is so devastating that it leaves the individual powerless to come to terms with it. Sometimes trauma is passed down from first-generation survivors through to generations that follow. This is referred to as intergenerational trauma. According to research, when a person experiences trauma, they are more likely to participate in self-damaging behaviours, develop a lifestyle of drug and alcohol abuse, develop health problems, and become or remain a part of the criminal justice system. Due to the trauma of colonisation, the mistreatment of the first people and the generations that followed, the rates of psychological health problems, addiction issues, imprisonment, poor health, domestic violence and suicide is much higher amongst Indigenous people. It is believed that Indigenous cultures are the oldest existing culture in the world, with the culture dating as far as 50,000 to 65,000 years. However, Indigenous Australians themselves trace their creation back to long before the Earth was formed. Aboriginal Australians see themselves as part of nature and see all natural things on Earth as part human. Indigenous Australians have an extremely special connection with all that is natural. They have a harmony and closeness with their surroundings. When Indigenous Australians belong to a specific area, they truly are a part of that area. And if that area becomes ruined, they too, as human beings, also become destroyed. Before British colonisation, it is estimated that there were between 1 and 1.5 million Aboriginals living in Australia. By 1901, less than 100,000 Aboriginal people existed. This large decrease in Australia's Aboriginal population was a product of genocidal policies that were carried out: disease, epidemics, mass killings, and the withdrawal of basic resources. Prior to the colonisation of Australia, there were between 350 to 750 different Indigenous groups in Australia. Each group communicated with their own dialect and language. Today, only 150 of these tribes survive, with around 20 of these languages almost extinct due to the ongoing genocide and cultural genocide of the remaining Indigenous societies today. In 1999, a report was published by the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, which researched deep into Australian genocide. The report that was written by Professor Colin Tatz supports that British abuses in Australia towards Indigenous Australians are tantamount to genocide. Indigenous Australians were considered barely human. They were seen as wild animals, a nuisance, repugnant to humanity, and they were fair game for white sportsmen. Aboriginals were not even considered citizens of their country until the law was changed during 1967. The Federal Constitution law that was written in 1900 clearly stated that Aboriginals would not be counted in any state or federal census. Aboriginal Australians were kept behind fences like in animals to ensure that no one got out. Disturbing photos of Australia's secret history expose the vicious treatment of Indigenous people that they were subjected to at the hands of the white population. They were often shackled together neck to neck by heavy chains in groups of 9 or 10, for years at a time. While chained neck to neck, they were forced to work on railways and roads. Children as young as 14 years of age were neck chained. There were no regulations as to the size, weight, manner of attachment or length of chain connecting to the necks to any two prisoners. Indigenous Australians were often arrested for petty crimes that they were unaware of committing, such as stealing cattle. Police were encouraged to apprehend and arrest Aboriginal people and were paid for each Indigenous person that they brought in. It was not until the 1940s that the practice of neck chains was phased out. However, this practice was still informally used in some parts of Australia until the 1960s. According to this report, over 10,000 Aborigines were killed between 1824 to 1908 in just Queensland alone. Even though there has been a growth in the population of Indigenous Australians since 1911, their conditions of life continue to be in a highly oppressive state. Throughout history, there are many examples of governing individuals mistreating and oppressing minor ones. This kind of discrimination appears to be an attribute of the unkind, civilised past. However, the existing problems of today's Indigenous population in Australia demonstrate that violence has no boundaries within its centuries. Indigenous Australians today belong to the most disadvantaged racial groups in the Australian society. They often suffer social neglect and prejudgments. And an example of this kind of neglect and prejudice is where a 16-year-old Aboriginal youth, without any considerable evidence, was beaten and accused by two men of intrusion into their private property. However, the high rate of battles between the criminal justice system and the Aboriginals is not the only problem that the Aboriginal have to deal with. Aboriginal people of Australia today also encounter numerous economic, social and cultural problems as well. An issue that has been brought to attention on numerous occasions is that of Aboriginal deaths in custody. In 1987, the government led by Bob Hawke decided that something must be done about the increasing complaints that Aboriginal people were dying in suspicious circumstances in police cells. A Royal Commission was then announced, which then investigated 99 Aboriginal deaths in custody over a 10-year period. The Commission submitted its final report in April 1991. The Royal Commission investigated the cause of death and looked at future prevention measures. Some of the questions that were asked were, why are so many Indigenous people in custody and why were they treated that way? The Royal Commission emphasised the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in custody and the criminal justice system in general, and compared it with non-Aboriginal people. Furthermore, the Royal Commission recognised that Aboriginal people were more likely to have died in police custody than in prison. It has now been over 25 years since the handing down of the Royal Commission of Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. Despite the handing down of recommendations, the number of Indigenous deaths in custody has not declined. During 1987 and 1991, while the Royal Commission was proceeding, there were 23 Indigenous deaths in prison custody and 28 in police custody. Between 2009 and 2013, there were 41 Indigenous deaths in prison custody and 19 in police custody. Instead of the problem getting better, it has become worse. Since the start of 1980 until the end of June 2011, 449 Indigenous people have died while in custody. Of all these deaths, there are only 2 cases where a Director of Public Prosecution has ever prosecuted an individual for the criminal killing of an Aboriginal person in custody. In recent times, positive efforts have been made by Indigenous Australians to avoid barriers to criminal prosecution through strong public advocacy. This advocacy can be seen in the case with Cameron Doomadgee. Cameron Doomadgee, who was also known as Mulrunji, was arrested on the 19th of November 2004 for supposedly causing a public nuisance. Doomadgee was taken into custody by Senior Sergeant Chris Hurley. Within an hour of Doomadgee's arrest, he was found dead in his cell. Doomadgee suffered a cut to his eye, broken ribs, his portal vein was ruptured, and his liver was almost split in 2. When the autopsy exposed the extent of Doomadgee's injuries, it sparked a riot which resulted in the police station and barracks being burnt to the ground. Sergeant Hurley was the first police officer to face trial over an Aboriginal death in custody in recent Australian history. In June 2007, Hurley was eventually cleared of manslaughter by an all-white jury, which resulted in additional outrage. Within a few weeks of Doomadgee's death, Hurley was relocated to work on the Gold Coast. He also received a compensation payout after his house was burnt down during the Palm Island riots. An Indigenous man dies in custody, and even though there were overwhelming evidence of guilt in a final coroner's report, along with the anti-corruption agency concluding that police were protecting Sergeant Hurley and that their investigation tainted the evidence, a police officer walks free. And therein lies the innate racism in the system. There are significant limitations to trying to hold either a police or corrective services officer criminally responsible for their roles in the deaths of Aboriginals in custody. The first issue is a hands-on difficulty where the investigations into deaths in custody are led by police. Often the suspected officer's case is investigated by their own colleagues. As a result, there is a conflict of interest, which then opens the door to collusion and corruption. There is also a history of the Department of Public Prosecutions to rarely prosecute police in Australia for Aboriginal deaths in custody. Aboriginal people die in custody due to government policies at odds with the recommendations of the Royal Commission. However, there are very few mechanisms that seem to be operative at holding governments answerable for legislative policies that jeopardise Aboriginal lives. As a country, we need to work together with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to help close the gap. This gap can help to be reduced by implementing all the recommendations of the Royal Commission. through support services, by investing money into communities, by acknowledging the driving influences of imprisonment, removing unnecessary imprisonment by offering rehabilitation, and also by holding police accountable for Aboriginal deaths in custody due to the lack of duty of care, and by ending the practice of police investigating police. By working together as a country with the Indigenous communities of Australia, early intervention strategies of prevention can help to reduce the number of deaths in custody. However, until those examining these Aboriginal deaths can do so without conflict of interest, it can be anticipated that the rule of law will most likely fall short for families looking for justice for the death of their loved ones while in custody.